Hello and welcome to the University of Pittsburgh's Health and Explainable AI, Pitt HexAI podcast series. Pitt HexAI is a research laboratory at the University of Pittsburgh School of Health and Rehabilitation Sciences, Department of Health Information Management. Headed by Ahmad Tafti, the lab cultivates extramural collaborations with other academic institutions, both nationally and internationally, through its research and educational contributions and this podcast series. Today on our podcast, we're going to speak with Adam Yala, Assistant Professor of Computational Precision Health at UC Berkeley and UCSF. Welcome, Adam. So to get us started, would you like to introduce yourself and tell us about your different affiliations?
Yeah, so I'm Adam Yala. I'm a professor of Computational Precision Health at UC Berkeley and UCSF. My primary hat is Computational Precision Health. It's this brand new department centered in both Berkeley and UCSF, meaning to bridge both like strong new computational methods and like actual translational change to clinical care. And it's a brand new program. We're recruiting our first class of PhD students right now. And we're really focused on kind of like this whole innovation to impact pipeline. So the kind of hope in many of these kind of projects is new kinds of tools and methods, new kinds of ideas of how we can drive computational interventions to make better care, all the way to clinical trials to actually seeing widespread impact. And it's something I'm super excited to be part of. On the eke side, I'm a computer scientist by training. I did my PhD in computer science at MIT. And there's lots of really close and natural intellectual collaborations across the many problems in machine learning for healthcare.
Got it. Love your enthusiasm. So what are you presently working on and what are you discovering?
Yeah, so it's an unhealthy habit. I try to work on many things and I try to hold myself back. But one of the primary thrusts I'm excited about now is methods to basically use everything we might know about our patients to better improve the screening and treatment selection process in cancer. Mm-hmm. So what I mean by that, if you take a step back, like how does cancer screening and cancer treatment work today? For the most part, it's always the same framework. Like we have expert clinical knowledge. Let's take breast cancer. We know age matters. We know family history matters. Maybe this notion of breast density, some marker of the breast. We ask these questions. We use really simple models, but we kind of pre-filter all the information in the world through these few questions, and then we drive that decision making. But you know so much more about a patient, right? Like you know every image over time, you know their entire medical record. You have all this complex information, and we just fail to leverage it. And that means that we're just losing a lot of ability to personalize care, and people are just lost along the way. So one of the kind of primary methodological thrusts that I work on is how do you better leverage everything to discover what's currently unknown about what in patients drives progression, and how do you tie that to better decision making? So one of the examples of my PhD was like if you look at a mammogram by itself, but like not the density of it, like the whole 100 million pixel image or sets of images, you can actually uncover way better biomarkers to inform who's going to get cancer than you could from the traditional approach. But even that's scratching the approach. We know much more than one mammogram about a patient. We know way more. And as you go to like scaling up, there's fundamental challenges both like on the machine learning side of like how do you even represent this? How do you learn representations? Kind of one piece of the puzzle. And the other part of which you do good predictions, like who cares about predictions? You need interventions, you need decisions. And how do you do better control in this like super high dimensional space? So this is one of my primary focuses that I'm super excited about.
Adam, that's so super interesting. And next, what can you tell us about the state of the art in health informatics and where in your view is the field heading?
Yeah, so I think it remains true that for most of our decision systems in health informatics are still relatively simple in the kinds of information we can use. We're still primarily we might use machine learning, let's say, to like extract things from the EMR, but we're still extracting mostly like questions we know to ask, putting them into some really simple representation and thinking of really simple interventions. And I think down the line, we will hope to get to eventually is a very flexible approach where we're discovering what matters directly from the data and not pre-curating it. So we can kind of leverage machine learning for discovery, not just for automation, and then discovering interventions accordingly and having a very flexible pipeline of new hypotheses to like a very efficient way to test these interventions in a really strong way. So it's a mixture of both like core representation learning and more causal inference work. I think it's going to be super exciting. I think the kind of where the state of the art is now is still this like larger scale approach is still kind of in its infancy. We see bits of it here and there of like maybe we'll use an image here, maybe we'll uncovering signal here, but the whole integration of it is still elusive for a variety of like methodological reasons, as well as like more conceptual and access reasons. And I think our ability to generate evidence at the RCT level in this computational interventions is still very nascent. And I think it's one of the major gaps. Like we need to have better mechanisms to drive ideas to change and the right evaluation frameworks, the right ways to kind of monitor them. And the best practices here are still nascent. Like in some ways, structurally, we're like, we have almost like a pharma style model without pharma style, like let's say IP type of protection or pharma style type of profit, which means that you have to have really crazy interventions to have it even go out. Our trials are a little bit too expensive as a framework. So there's lots of systemic change we need to make this machine work.
Yeah. I'm curious if we got time for a quick squeeze in. You've mentioned interventions a few times, and I just wonder, do we have time to just look at that?
Yeah, so I think this is actually going to touch on some things I'll also say later. I think like one thing I always think about is it's not about the prediction problem, right? In ML, we tend to think of like, we have data, we can predict a thing, like let's say who's going to get cancer, predict this as well as possible. I will argue that does not matter. What matters is what you will do with that information, right? Like if I can give you a perfect prediction of something that you can't do anything about, that's just not useful, right? Like what you really want to do is understand what should you do. That's the intervention. So it either means like get screened differently, get screened as you're planning to get screened, take this preventative measure or not. That's what I mean by intervention. So like going away from prediction to decision making. And depending on the disease system, right, then like the decision making is different, right? You have different like levers you can pull on.
Right. They're putting it all together. And yeah, that's really super important. I'm curious as well if you can maybe connect the dots from now and, what you see or envision in 10 years' time, let's say.
Sure. Yeah. So let me zoom in a little bit to like breast cancer screening in terms of how we think about like screening guidelines, like who gets screened with what and when, because this kind of drives both our early detection process and our like any amount of overtreatment, overdiagnosis, all kind of fits within this bubble. How it works now clinically is you have like these like expert questionnaire type of risk models that ask you maybe like between 3 to like 60 questions that we rely on expert knowledge, and they're not super accurate. The computational state of the art now is models like Mirai, something I built my PhD, where you basically take full resolution imaging and you then predict the risk of cancer over time. And there's other tools that we developed that kind of ties that to how do you just craft like who comes back when, it's kind of screening policies. So it's using more information. We have better tools to create decisions with that information, but we're still only using a small fraction of what's possible, right? Zooming forward to like 10 years from now, what I ideally want to have is a system in not just a single image, but like everything that might be relevant to patient over time, we discover that, right? We have longitudinal imaging across multiple modalities. We have other kinds of information about through someone's like EMR, other information at home that all kind of drives things. That is deeply intertwined with how we have the kind of interventions we can imagine to improve early detection and reduce overtreatment. So both personalized measures of prevention, both in terms of preventative drugs, targeted screening to say this is the right kind of screen that's likely to work for this person at this time, and have everything kind of be deeply integrated to the context about the patient, both in terms of like getting the best outcomes and addressing their barriers to care. So both reducing disparities, and that's the whole kind of puzzle. The other thing I think is going to be really important is ideally it won't take like a decade of trials for every new model to come in. Because if you have this kind of like, if it's an algorithm that's driving how we think about care, new students can compete and improve the algorithm like every other week, right? And ideally, what you want to see is some kind of very efficient pipeline of we have new things, we have a fixed way to generate the evidence of these new things, we've kind of ironed this out. So that way it's not like some decades process to go from improved technology to change. Like breast density, which is now the mainstream thing in breast cancer screening, is like big trials in Europe that resulted in like standard change. It's now part of like federal reporting in the US. That thing was discovered in 1969. It went from 1969 to like 2019 to go from like people talking about it as being a potential risk marker to like in the early 2020s, people putting into risk models into now. And it's not that good. And like, I'll be damned if it's another like 50, 60-year picture.
Wow.
Every single time we come up with something new. And especially as for discovering new things as a computational process.
Adam, wow, from 1969 to now and then 10 years' time, with this field of health informatics and explainable AI, what's your take on explainability and explainability's relevance to your work? And perhaps you can expand further on what you were just mentioning about, everything to do with, new algorithms and where that space is going. That would be great.
Yeah, so I think in a way, a lot of times our conversations on explainability is a little bit too vague in a sense. So which we say what is explainable, nothing is explainable in general, right? I think like it's all more concrete when we say for this particular use case, what information does the model need to surface for us to make good decisions with it? Right. So take, for example, I'm going to give a couple of tool examples that are like non-AI to kind of illustrate the point and then talk about the AI version of this. So like, let's say I'm driving and I want to brake. I do not want an explanation about my brake. I want it to brake. And my notion of reliability is that it's tested, there's safety standards and how that brake is going to work every time that I use it. And all I want is for it to brake. And if it gives me a pop-up screen about how brakes work every time I brake, I'm going to be really mad. If I'm trying to decide whether or not I'm buying a house and I'm just seeing a number, I want to understand where that number is coming from. That way I can work to change the parameters. Is it something about the amount of down payment I'm putting down? Is it this other factor? What's the interest rate? Because the decision I'm making isn't just take the number or not. It's I'm factoring other decisions where the other kind of presentation information is really useful to me. So bringing that back to the AI space, like the kind of explanations we need fundamentally co-designs with the workflow we're trying to enable. Right? If you're trying to have something sitting behind the work, we're saying who comes back when, we're doing kind of like screening optimization process. And the only recommendation is like come back in a year or two or whatever is the kind of current screening guideline. That is, the explanation for that is what is the anticipated benefit of these different trade-offs. Right? It's not a heat map because that's not what you're trying to understand. You're trying to understand what decision to make. If you're saying here is a diagnosis, get surgery, well, you should probably know where, and you should probably, there's lots of other things that we'd call explanations of that would help you inform that decision. So I think like what is the necessary step in this kind of line of work more broadly is deeply tying the method of explanation to the use case. Because I think there's no panacea, right? There's no, like if you give me a post-hoc explanation technique, like gradient attribution maps, that might be the right thing for a very particular kind of use case. It can be useful for kind of diagnosing model faults in some ways or the other, but it misses the opportunity to like really design what is that interface and like how does the model present information with the decision system itself, because then you can make a better algorithm for it. And I think this kind of deeper integration is the necessary feature.
Thanks for that. And you talked about explainability. What else is needed from your point of view?
Yeah, so one type of property that I think is super, super important is notions of robustness and like knowing limitations of use. So what I mean by that is, let's imagine you have, this is a very widely deployed kind of tool in clinical care. You have a sepsis risk prediction tool applied. You want to understand who's likely to get sepsis. So you can give them antibiotics to intervene to save lives. Sepsis is a major cause of death. Lots of companies are trying to solve this problem. Super, super widely adopted. In this setting, different models have different number of risk factors, but really you're trying to get in a little bit who to intervene on. And the kind of guarantee that you want is if I take this tool and I apply it at my new hospital, it's going to work. And if it works now, I want to know that it's going to continue working tomorrow and next week. And if it's going to stop working, I'd rather find out beforehand rather than, oh, more people had lots of issues and I found out after I got enough complaints. So there's a mixture of like basically what is generalization, both across centers and over time. And then if you're not going to generalize, how do you build meaningful alert systems and abstain from prediction and basically raise the safety warning? And similar to the car example, you have like lights that say like, oh, maybe change your brakes, this kind of thing. And I think this is part of the kind of fundamental tooling that's needed to move the space forward. And I think some of our regulatory space really doesn't grasp this. Like let's say you have a drug, right? The drug works this year, it's going to work next year. Even though our biology isn't changing day over day to make drugs suddenly stop working. That's not true when you have a decision system based on our outputs, right? Like if we do decision-making in this way and our ML model looks at how we were behaving to predict who's going to get sepsis, if we behave differently, it has no idea, right? Like we are changing and outputs based on our workflows, if our workflows continually evolve over time, can break the model. So it's not enough to test it once. You have to kind of test it all the time. And you'd want to find ways to say this is going to break preemptively because the data distribution is changing. And there's like a lot of work to do in creating real benchmarks to characterize this because like this is a technology problem, right? Like how do you estimate generalization? You can do immediate testing, kind of find, there's like a best practices problem I think is like a fundamental one for the community to solve. And the hardest version of this is EMR-based systems where it's fundamentally like evolving over time. Like an image is easier. Images and image our chests don't change dramatically year over year, but an EMR is a dramatic kind of beast.
So how important are all these data sets? And, what can you tell students about how important this is right now?
Access to good public data sets is one of the fundamental, like if I had to say like what's one thing that holds the space back, it's access to data sets. For many kinds, like, it's not a hot take for me to say like robustness is important, robustness over time is important. These are kind of like issues that someone kind of comes across as they try deploying things, relatively straightforward. What's not straightforward is being able to actually work on them. Like if you only have data from one hospital, and if you're someone working in partnership with a hospital, you tend to have one. If you're a computer scientist outside of one, you tend to have zero. You're totally locked out. If you only have one, how do you study robustness to other hospitals? Without any other hospitals, you simply can't. How do you study robustness over time? Without any temporal data, you simply can't. And so we're kind of in this weird siloed system in which, for the most part, we're all solving these problems independently. We have very limited infrastructure to answer questions. And unlike the rest of, let's say, the computer science domain, where we have lots of shared data sets, we have like tens of thousands of people competing in the same kind of benchmarks. We have very little of that in medicine, right? Even in breast cancer, which is a very big space. It's like there's both a lot of commercial interest. There's many groups that are interested. It's a very common disease with lots of imaging collected. Hundreds of millions of people get screened every year. To date, embed dataset is the first of a modern dataset that's actually available for people to download at scale. Right, like before that, it was a dataset from the 90s that had digital film that's not representative of current screening. So unless you went through the work to build a relationship with a specific health system, you're locked out of the field. So you can't even work to address the problems. Like in the robustness issue we talked about, many people in the medical community are working on it, but not in ways that are directly relevant to healthcare because they simply can't. Right, like we have all of these robustness benchmarks of what if you take an image, which is dogs and cats, and you make it blurry. Or you make it like the winter filter in Photoshop, or you make it this other random filter in Photoshop. Is that how EMR change? No. Can you make people work on it? Also no, because they don't have data over time. Outside of just Mimic, which is just the ER department in one part of the country. There's a fundamental, there's many bottlenecks in life, right? There's methods we need to invent, but it's hard to invent methods in the vacuum. So data sets are incredibly important.
I'm just going to ask a question to follow up what you just said. What would be your dream data set right now?
In a way, I'm greedy. There's many things I want to see. I have many, many hopes and goals. Something I think needs large data sets. There's unique in my need for, let's say, is a treatment response in the case of neoadjuvant therapy in either pancreatic or breast cancer. So let me lay the setup. Right? Any treatment response problem is fundamentally limited data. In people that already have cancer, that's a small subset year over year in any hospital system. And we want to understand who should get which therapy to shrink the tumor before surgery. If you can shrink it before surgery, you can tend to get better or equivalent outcome for much less morbidities. It's just better for the patient. In cases like pancreatic cancer, it's even more important because people tend to be very ill. If you give them the wrong one first, they're unlikely to be healthy enough to take a second try. Fundamentally, there's a problem. We have images, we have some information about the patient, we give them a treatment, and something changed or didn't change. But we never have that many per place. So even in a big referral tertiary center like UCSF, where I have very happy to have lots of collaborators, we have hundreds to thousands. In the country, we have lots more. But there's things we just can't discover alone. And only if we federate out or invent lots of crazy new methods to try to get information from other kinds of sources can we make progress on this problem. And there's many versions of this where rare diseases are rare for a hospital. They're not rare in general. Right? There's a reason why pancreatic cancer, for example, is relatively rare, but it's one of the leading cancer causes of death. It's only rare per hospital, and we can only make meaningful progress if we learn to share.
Thank you so much, Adam. That was really insightful. So before we close, we like to ask all of our guests to offer students who are interested in health informatics and explainable AI a research project idea. What's something that you'd love to see students work on?
Yeah, so my answer here, in a way, not going to be prescriptive. It's a style of approach. So I think a big room to be creative and where a lot of the impact remains to be seen is in how we even frame the question to solve the right problems. One kind of piece of advice I always give my students is, imagine you already built the ML model. It already works. What's next? Is this actually driving decision making in the way? How would you translate this to care, and how do you build the evidence to get there? Because sometimes you realize that based on how you're using the tool, you actually need to change the model altogether. Based on how you'd have to monitor it to get it through regulatory, you have to change how the model works altogether. And so I think there's a huge space for creative problem solving. And this is where it's still a kind of an art of how do you take a core healthcare problem and then say what algorithm needs to exist. Not how to make the algorithm itself. That's also hard. That's also a skill set we can develop and train, and we can do innovation there. But more of the fundamental, what algorithm needs to exist to empower this? What are the key disorata of said algorithm? And then let's invent it. And I think this kind of missing skill is non-trivial and something that's really important to hone. And that's where a lot of the value is. Because it's not in some other domains you have working object recognition, there are cats, there are dogs, solve that problem better. finding the right thing to be solving is one of the key fundamental hard things in computation for healthcare. And it's something to dive into, embrace fully.
Beautiful. I love that art and algorithms. I haven't quite heard it described that way. That was really lovely. So lastly, what's something that students have brought to your attention that you might like to share?
So I have lots of very technical versions of this answer. So I have lots of, obviously, like method discussions with my students. I think something that's been really interesting to me recently is mechanisms to let complex neural networks reason across super, super large data sets that won't fit on hardware in the next, let's say, 5 years, even optimistically with current hardware growth rates. So I think there's some exciting things happening in the methodological landscape of how we can kind of reason about this kind of problem. In parallel, there's something else I'm particularly excited about the mechanisms to build really efficient conditional generative models. So what I mean by that is like we have better and better models of, let's say, dogs and cats, like DALL-E, Stable Diffusion, all these kind of like big generative models. But if you want to control them for, let's say, what speech is likely to be generated for this very small neuronal pattern activity to help paralyzed people speak, right? That's a very small data, but we still have speech data in an unsupervised way. You have lots of speech data. So how do you make very efficient conditional generative models given access to only unconditional data? I think is a fascinating intellectual problem that I think we can make some progress on. There's lots of being an academic is so you can talk to students and have fun technical discussions and impact strategy discussions. And it's a fun time.
Keeps you on your toes. I love it. So Adam, it's been really great speaking with you today. Would you like to offer a closing takeaway to our listeners?
Sure. Yeah. So one, again, thank you for having me. In terms of like closing takeaways, I think this is a space that's still very nascent and it's a space where students can have an immense impact and and it's fundamentally hard. So I guess my key recommendation to students at scale is it's not a short game. It's not about a paper. It's about actually changing something in care. And with that objective in mind, it's really healthy and important to kind of backtrack. What are the things you need to solve from there and making sure we're solving the right question? I think the kind of easiest failure mode is spending a lot of time building a model is not actually directly useful. So I would say like stepping back, takeaways, let decision-making drive method development, let that drive the desiderata. Don't lose hope because resilience is part of the competitive advantage, right? It's a structurally hard thing to work on. It's only going to get better if we put in the effort. And if students younger and pre-PhD, I highly recommend them to consider Computational Precision Health at Berkeley-UCSF or a brand new program designed for just this.
Well, thanks again, Adam Yala from UC Berkeley and UC San Francisco. Thanks everyone for tuning in and for following the show. And a special thanks to the University of Pittsburgh School of Health and Rehabilitation Sciences, Department of Health Information Management, and to Pitt's Health and Explainable AI Research Laboratory for launching this podcast. We'll see you next month.